So what are the specifics of what the Trump administration is or is not willing to do in Venezuela? Well, today, the White House Director of Strategic Communications came to CBS 4.
Mercedes Schlapp sat down with CBS 4's Jim DeFede to talk about the crisis and the Trump administration's response. Here's part of their conversation.
We are looking for a peaceful transition. That's critical to us. We are putting a pressure campaign on Maduro, both economic sanctions, diplomatic sanctions, and hoping to tighten the pressure on Maduro. And that's why, for example, we've sanctioned the Venezuelan state-owned oil industry. We've sanctioned individuals in Maduro's regime, and really try to shut down the currency that Maduro is able to gain access to.
It seemed like you wanted to say the noose around Maduro there for a second, which leads me to ask, to what extent is there likely to be a military option here in removing Maduro?
Well, the president's evaluating all different options. At this point, his goal is to bring more countries on board to recognize Juan Guaido. What we have right now is about 50 nations that are recognizing the new government, and again, trying to send the message to Maduro that it's time for him to leave and basically go live in a happy place in Cuba, if that's possible. Because what we do know is that it is Cuba and their security forces that are basically continuing to prop up the Maduro regime. More and more, we're seeing rank-and-file military officials in favor of Guaido. We're also seeing the students, the church, all these different groups coming together to say, Maduro, please exit. We're ready for a new government in Venezuela.
Well, that raises an interesting point. Who actually controls the Venezuelan military at this point? Is it Maduro or is it the Cubans?
Well, there's more rank-and-file military officials who are supporting Guaido. Guaido has offered amnesty to the military officials. Again, our goal is a peaceful transition towards a new government. There are those handful of generals who are still sticking with Maduro. We're going to keep putting pressure on these military officials and remind them that there's a stark contrast right now, and they need to make a decision before their time is up in terms of whether they would accept an amnesty and support Guaido.
But to what extent does Cuba control things in Venezuela?
Well, right now, based on the information we have, they've got about 20 to 25,000 security forces in Venezuela. So their goal is, again, to try to maintain as much power as they can in Venezuela. We're hoping to put enough pressure to not let them allow access into currencies, which would keep them propped up. And as you know, Maduro right now is starving his own people by not allowing the humanitarian aid to come into Venezuela.
So let's talk about the humanitarian aid. I know that the United States has been sending humanitarian aid to the neighboring countries, Brazil, Colombia, others, and that there's going to be an effort to try to bring that aid into Venezuela. Is that likely to become the flashpoint? Is that likely to become the moment where either the military allows the aid to come in, and if not, then would the U.S. be willing to force the aid into Venezuela?
Yes, I think February 23rd is that deadline, and Guaido is looking to find ways where certain individuals in Venezuela can help ensure that we can get the humanitarian aid in. You know, that's going to be a very crucial point to determine how Maduro is going to react. I think the international community is watching very closely to see if he's going to allow this humanitarian aid. This would go directly to the Venezuelan people. There's food, there's medical supplies. We're at a point right now that there are so many Venezuelans who are starving. I mean, malnutrition is rampant. The fact is the hospitals don't have the medical supplies that they need. Maduro needs to make a choice. If he cares so much about the Venezuelan people, he needs to leave. He needs to push forward in terms of this transition. And we want to ensure that Guaido is in place to be able to ensure a peaceful transition into democracy.
Would the U.S. military, would the U.S. be willing to use its military to guarantee that that aid gets into Venezuela?
You know, I'm not going to go ahead of anything that the president might decide on this issue. Again, as I've said before, we're evaluating all options.
Why do you think this issue resonates with the president?
I think the president has seen the horrors of socialism and communism and has seen how that could destroy the economic and social fabric of any nation, and Venezuela in particular, because you're seeing that in the past decade, it's gone from a very rich, prosperous country where there was a booming middle class to now people starving. And so the president has seen, when you have government controls of industry, when you take away people's freedoms, that it destroys the spirit of a nation. And as we've seen the Democratic Party move more to becoming the Socialist Party and taking extreme agenda items and setting them on the table, I think the president wants to send a very clear message that America will never be a socialist country. We were born free and we will remain free.
Do you, and the last point, I'll just sort of, because I feel the need to push back a little bit on that, do you really envision that the United States is at risk of becoming a socialist country? And isn't that a bit of fear-mongering on the president's part?
Not at all. I mean, I think about my father, who was a political prisoner in Cuba, someone who taught me that democracy is fragile, that we need to spend time in protecting our democracy. When you look at the Democratic agenda and how they're moving towards a Green New Deal, where you literally take airplanes out of the air and you basically pay people for doing absolutely nothing, and they move towards government-controlled health care, those are socialist elements that have no place in American politics.